Good evening. A long time ago, when I was in my 20s, I read The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, a novel by the Czech writer Milan Kundera about the nature of forgetting in politics, in history, and life in general. At the time, there was one particular line that struck me. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. This sounded profound to me as a 25-year-old, even if I didn't quite understand what it meant. So what does this mean for us as individuals and us as societies? If I say the names Hiroshima and Nagasaki to you, I'm sure most people will think of the same things. These names are synonymous with death and destruction, with the atomic bombs. And each year, 1 to 2 million people visit Hiroshima's sites of war memory, the atomic bomb dome, the Peace Memorial and Museum. People come to learn, to remember, and to pay their respects. But what if I told you that the single most destructive air raid in history was not in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but right here in Tokyo? On March 10th, 1945, the US Army Air Force launched a massive attack on the city. This was codenamed Operation Meeting House, but it's more commonly known as the Great Tokyo Air Raid, or the Firebombing of Tokyo. If you've ever been to Asakusa or to Tokyo Skytree, you've walked these streets that were once littered with bodies. So, for those of you who might not be so familiar with the firebombing, let me paint you a picture. As midnight approached on March 9th, 1945, more than 300 US B-29 bombers closed in on the working class districts of eastern Tokyo, the most densely populated area of the city. They were carrying 1,500 tons of incendiary or fire bombs. These bombs were designed to break open and scatter as they fell. And wherever they landed, they would shoot out flaming blobs, which stuck to any kind of surface. This was one of the earliest military uses of napalm, which would later become infamous in the Vietnam War. At 8 minutes past midnight, the first planes unleashed this payload on the sleeping citizens below. As air raid sirens rang out and people scrambled from their houses, the city was already in flames. One survivor described it to me as like a sea of fire. The attack lasted only about 2.5 hours, but the fires continued to burn through the night. There were fierce winds which created a firestorm. Tens of thousands of people asphyxiated or were burnt alive. Many of them were burnt so badly it was impossible to know if they were male or female. Many others plunged into rivers and canals to escape the flames, only to die of the cold or to drown. By morning, 100,000 people had been killed, overwhelmingly civilians. More than 1 million people made homeless, and roughly 1/4 of the city destroyed. I think it's worth remembering that this attack took hundreds of planes and thousands of bombs. But a few months later, in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, it would take only 1 plane and 1 bomb. But the intention and the result were the same: to wipe out a city and the people who lived and worked there, all in the name of crippling industry and bringing the war to a close. General Curtis LeMay, who's the architect of the Tokyo firebombing, famously said, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at the time. I suppose if I'd lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." Although I live in Tokyo now, originally I'm from Australia. And so I grew up thinking we were fighting the good war. I grew up with stories of Allied bravery and of the cruelty of the Japanese military. But I didn't learn anything about how Japanese civilians experienced war. Even after living here in Tokyo, I didn't know about the firebombing. This changed when I saw a documentary film called The Fog of War. And in one harrowing sequence, it shows the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. This was a shocking moment for me. It was a life-changing moment for me. Not just because of the scale of death and destruction, but because I hadn't known anything about it. I hadn't seen any signs of what happened here in Tokyo. I didn't know if there was a museum or a memorial. And when I asked Japanese friends about it, most of them did know the attack had happened, but didn't seem to know anything more than the basic facts. Think about this. The most destructive air raid in all human history reduced to a few lines in a textbook. I couldn't understand why this attack wasn't a bigger part of the identity of people here, the way the attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are for those people, or the way September 11 is for New Yorkers. Why was Tokyo different? I became so obsessed with this question that I decided to make a documentary film about it, about what we choose to remember, about what we want to forget, and about what the consequences of that are. At the time, most of the information I could find in English was about the political and the military aspects of the firebombing. It was told from the Allied point of view and seemed to say basically that the attacks were a necessary evil. There was almost nothing written about the people on the ground that night, about what it meant to kill so many civilians. I knew I wanted to hear the story from their point of view, and so I began to reach out to survivors. They told me a lot about what it was like to live through the war years. Of course, at the time, Japan was a military society. Soldiers were on top and civilians below. People really had no choice but to support the war. They were fed a diet of propaganda. Dissenters could be sent to jail, and school classes were often replaced with military exercises or with factory work. Through years of war deprivation, people cooperated as best they could. They sacrificed their freedom, their educations, their incomes, their happiness, and they often sacrificed their sons to the imperial war effort abroad. And then the war finally came home. At first, the US attempted precision bombing of military targets, but then abruptly switched tactics, and from March to August 1945 launched a relentless campaign of area bombing against Japan's cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, essentially every medium to large city in the country. By this stage, Japan's air defenses were almost completely ineffective, and so each night people went to sleep fearing that that might be their last. In all, 67 cities were firebombed, and still the war went on. Consider this too. At the time, Japanese civilians were told not to flee, that in the event of an air raid, they were to stand their ground and fight fires, not only to protect their own homes, but to protect the city itself. In fact, people were legally compelled to do so. There was an air defense law which anchored people in place with the threat of fines or even jail time. And then, in August, it was finally over. The people were left to rebuild their broken lives. And they did. But there was no post-war fund to help those who lost everything. There was no help for most people at all. And even orphans were forced to fend for themselves on the streets. In contrast, the Japanese government gave and continues to give generous support to military casualties and their families. To this date, more than 60 trillion yen. You know, when I first started this project, I thought it was just going to be a film about the past, about survivors' memories of what happened. But it became about much, much more. Each survivor I met was a kind of memory activist, fighting to leave behind their stories so that future generations, so that you and I would know the truth of what happened. And since the 1960s, they've asked the Tokyo and national governments to help them do this. They've asked for a peace museum. They've asked for a dedicated memorial to the firebomb. They've asked for some token compensation for those who lost everything. And they've asked for an apology. At the heart of each of these demands, I think, is a simple plea for their own government to take responsibility for the suffering it forced upon millions of people at home and abroad. But after 6 decades of campaigning, survivors are still waiting. I've heard many of them wonder aloud if the government is just waiting for them to die, waiting for this issue to fade away. We decided to call our film Paper City because at the time of the firebombing, Japanese houses were made of wood and paper. Tokyo was a tinderbox, and it's for precisely this reason that the US bombed where it did, in the most built-up parts of the city. But there's one more reason. Paper is a way of recording and passing on memory. And each time I met survivors, they used paper to tell their stories. Name scrolls, photographs, maps, their written testimonies. But paper is fragile. It can decay or it can burn. Survivors are campaigning to leave behind something more concrete. A museum, a memorial, an apology. An imprint on the public memory that will last even after survivors themselves have passed away. This desire to leave behind something resonates very strongly with me as a filmmaker, but I think it's fundamental to all of us to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. The survivors' greatest fear is if they don't pass their stories on, the firebombing will soon slip from public consciousness, effectively as if it never actually happened. I think it's a terrible irony that school kids in Tokyo go to Hiroshima to learn about the war. Very few people come to Tokyo to learn, remember, or pay their respects, because it would never occur to them to do so. And even if they did, where would they go? So Paper City is a story not just about erasing civilians through mass murder, but of their post-war erasure from public memory and public space. The first by the US, the second at the hands of the Japanese state. You know, in the last few years, I've been thinking a lot about how limited our view of war is when we think about it simply as nation versus nation, good against evil, or us against them. In reality, whichever side they're on, it's increasingly civilians that bear the brunt of war. In World War I, only 5% of all casualties were civilians. By World War II, this had increased to half. And since the 1990s, 90% of all wartime casualties are civilians. Perhaps it's not so much a matter of nation versus nation, but of the powerful over the weak, of governments and militaries making decisions at the expense of the people, dragging us into wars we don't want. Already it feels like we're being groomed to support another one. Here in Japan, the government has vowed to double defense spending, and in the next few years, the debate about Japan's peace constitution is going to intensify. Japan will decide what kind of country it wants to be. And ordinary people, people like you and I, who know very little about war, we will be swayed by the arguments of politicians and the media. But if we don't know the horrors of the past, how can we act as a handbrake on our government's most belligerent impulses? Perhaps soon Japan will have a military that can fight abroad like many other countries. But what if we have this the wrong way round? What if Japan's peace constitution were the model for other countries to aspire to? What if our constitutions also limited our use of force to self-defense? The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. It's been 78 years now since the end of World War II, and soon the last survivors with a living memory of what happened will be gone. That direct link with the past will be broken. But survivors are leaving us with a rich legacy of their stories. It's up to us to decide what to do with them. And as the shadow of war now looms over us once again, survivors are leaving us with a question too. Will we listen and learn? Or will we forget? Thank you.